Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in late Heian, Japan, with the Heike Monogatari, written by anonymous storytellers. The Heike opens not by setting a scene of internal psychology, but by striking a bell, and that bell sets the tone. The sound that drifts across a temple courtyard becomes a law for the people we meet. Characters arrive already shaped to that toll, and the tale writes them as embodiments rather than private souls. They enter as types that need to perform a moral truth. The house that rises, the youth cut down, the soldier who cannot live with his hands. That method makes the narrative feel like a mirror held up to a changing world. What reflects is not a single reflected face, but an entire social shape. The bell's echo teaches you a posture for listening. Do not expect the novel's private interior where a person surprises you by contradicting themselves. Rather expect the visible logic of decline, visible in acts and omens, where each life demonstrates a rule. That choice lifts the Heike out of mere chronicle and makes it a moral geometry, where every turn, every battlefield, every lament functions as proof. Within that moral geometry, certain figures carry the same function. One set wears the weight of overreach. They climb until sight blinds them and reforms gather to unmake their house. Another set carries wasted youth, beauty and skill extinguished before they can become public goods. A third set bears the felony of violence that refuses to stop, and that refusal becomes a burden until it breaks into penitence. A fourth set survives by memory and withdrawal, keeping the story while the world they knew crumbles. Those four are not accidental repeats. They are the tale's operating system. It uses individual episodes like rules in a game. The overreacher does not exist to be pitied as one man might be. He exists to show the logic by which a ruling house collapses under its own excess. The doomed youth does not serve only the tragedy of one life. He becomes proof that war consumes the best prizes of a social order. The penitent warrior demonstrates the moral cost of a society that prizes slaughter. The survivor shows how memory converts the past into a pattern that will console, yet will not restore what was lost. Watching them together reveals the Heike's argument by composition, not by argument alone. The overreacher appears as power in full flower, and then as the cause of its own unmaking. Heike scenes present his triumphs in a way that tastes like gilded architecture, court processions, appointments to positions no one had imagined, a palace almost daring the heavens. The tale accumulates these triumphs like a ledger, and then it reads that ledger backward as omen. Triumph becomes motif for doom because each display of excess calls for a counter moment. The boat overturned, the festival empty, the sudden death at the back stair. The story presses this until you feel the inevitability not as fate but as arithmetic. When a single house seizes the levers of court and war, it concentrates enemies, debts, reputations, and a brittle succession. The Heike narrates how foreign the result is to what the overreacher imagined. Power meant comfort becomes a fast trap, and it shows the world reorganizing in response. The overreacher's arcs are not psychological puzzles. They illustrate structural overreach. You can buy offices, you can force marriages, you can bend ritual to your advantage, but every such force creates a counterforce that needs a violent, often terminal, release. That release is not theatrical flourish, but the practical collapse of a social contract. And the tale composes it so you see the arithmetic of collapse before the bodies close the ledger. The doomed youth is folded into that arithmetic as evidence that rise and fall take human shape. The narrative does not dwell on inner desires. It paints the young as a visible expense. The story shows a young man stepping into the reeds with a flute at his waist, the reeds shaking from one moment to the next, the music interrupted by a single blow. The flute's sound, the slenderness of the figure, the blood staining the reeds. These details make the event feel like a sacrificial proof that war devours beauty. In a different scene, a child sits in royal robes, bewildered by men moving around him, and the next moment the sea claims the child and the regalia. The tale stages youth as the fragile ledger entry that proves the cost of the adult's ambitions. The use of the young does more than make us pity. It supplies the narrative with moral currency. Once young lives are spent, the tale can sum up the loss in a tone that households and temples understand. Those deaths are not private tragedies buried in bedsheets. They become measurements. The youth demonstrate how social energy, education, artistry, dynastic potential transmutes into wreckage when the system that supports it fractures. That conversion is the Heike's way of making politics visible as human flesh. The penitent warrior occupies a different but linked function. He embodies the moral rip in a society that resorts to slaughter to settle claims. The tale gives a brutal compact scene. A soldier confronts a young fighter, realizes the age and tenderness of the opponent, and then strikes. That strike comes equipped with recognition and remorse. The killer can recall his own child, picture his lineage, recall the abruptness with which life can be taken. Then he becomes a monastic figure. The move from sword to robe is not a private confession so much as a ritual correction the tale insists upon. It contains an admission that violence, when transported into the social body, demands expiation, and expiation must aim at renunciation. The warrior's repentance dramatizes the tale's Buddhist impulse. Blood demands a counter-practice of renunciation. But the Heike does not resolve this into simple redemption. The penitent's robe witnesses a rupture not repaired. The monk has removed the sword but cannot return the wasted youth to the earth, cannot spool back the currents that led to the killing. His penance proves ruin. It marks the moral cost visibly and records a way communities cope. Withdraw, remember, pray. That withdrawal appears in the narrative not as escape, but as a new role, one that preserves memory while acknowledging it cannot restore what was destroyed. Those withdrawals give us the survivor function, the one who carries memory so loss does not vanish. The tale is itself a survivor's profession. Some characters become keepers of ruins. They collect the names of the dead, they recite the events, they walk to the temples and place their sorrow before stones. One woman, a witness who clings to memory, lives through the contest, sees a child vanish beneath a wave, and then spends her days recalling that vanishing as if rehearsal could hold the past in place. Her conversion to religious life is less a personal bolt from heaven and more a social mechanism for remembering. She becomes a living archive. The narrative uses such figures to argue that memory itself becomes a vocation after catastrophe. The survivor's lament does not try to restore the old order. Instead, it keeps a visible difference between what was and what remains. And by doing so, the survivor performs the Heike's central work, transforming a series of losses into a moral narrative that explains why the social world must change. Memory, then, acts as connective tissue between events. It frames the arithmetic of decline into a story that can be carried, performed, and therefore learned. Those functions arrange themselves into causal chains inside the tale. The overreacher's ascent provokes enemies whose tactics exploit youthful valor and produce battlefield slaughter, which in turn begets penitent withdrawal and survivor memory. But the Heike keeps these relations structural, not sentimental. Power's arrogance produces military backlash. Military backlash consumes youth. Consumed youth produce remorse. Remorse produces monastic institutions and ritual remembrances that reshape the cultural map. The narrative treats these as practical events of governance as much as moral ones. When the tale shows a palace, it balances the image of opulence with the ledger of slaughter that financed it. When it shows a battlefield, it balances the clash with the afterlife of prayers and temple offerings that try to settle debts. The shots are arranged so the eye moves from a triumphal banner to an overturned boat to a monk's shaved head in a single motion. The result is an argument carved out of scenes rather than a philosophical treatise. Within that argument, a man of cold calculation plays the role of consolidator. The tale differentiates two kinds of power, the one that dazzles and the one that organizes. One figure exemplifies the frigid, administrative logic that takes root where spectacle has failed. His career is quiet in the text, no swaggering rituals, no bell-chiming pageantry, and that quiet is the point. Consolidation is an economy of silence. The story dramatizes how such consolidation strips the show from power and replaces it with office, garrison, and law. It shows the organizer methodically insulating himself from the kind of spectacular defeat that finished his rivals. The tale treats this method as both necessary and morally hollow. Necessary because society craves order after collapse. Hollow because the consolidation that saves the polity also kills the imaginative and ceremonial energies that made the old court radiant. This shift is not cast as simple improvement. The Heike makes you feel the subtle trade-off, the loss of poetry for stability, and lets the survivors, liturgies register how much has been traded away. That trade-off lets the narrative make a more difficult claim. Characters are not merely agents, but evidence. Their deaths, penances, and retreats measure a social conversion from expressive aristocracy to managerial governance. The tale composes episodes so that the reader sees not only that people suffer, but how suffering registers the system's reconfiguration. A courtier's marriage, a general's order, a child's drowning, each functions as a datum on a chart of decline. The Heike is careful to keep its moral language embedded in such data, so that the listener understands the ethical lesson as a pattern rather than as a personal indictment. The narrative's moral tone aims not primarily at punishment of individuals, but at diagnosis of a house and age. The figures provide the clinical signs. Because the tale uses human bodies as instruments for this diagnosis, it insists on particular scenes that make the structural logic obvious. A naval engagement becomes a theater where ritual and reality collide. Banners fly, the emperor sits on the deck, the tide moves like a clock hand, and then a single wave becomes a verdict. The scene evacuates intimacy. No private conversation can stop the water, and shows how institutions, too, are swept. The sinking of regalia, the loss of a child emperor, the boat breaking apart. These images keep repeating with slight variations because repetition turns them into proof. The tale wants the moral to feel inevitable. It constructs inevitability by cartography, mapping triumphs and losses into neighboring events so causality appears as arrangement. As you listen, You feel the house's life as a line on a map that climbs, bends, and finally goes under. The characters are the points on that trajectory. There is a deep austerity in the Heike's compassion. The tale refuses to redeem its overreacher by a last-minute confession. It refuses to argue that remorse undoes harm. It converts remorse into ritual and memory, and it accepts that some losses remain incontestable. A penitent monk is not a restored man, but a record of what violence demanded. The narrative's compassion thus serves a pedagogical role. It shows how communities must respond, not how individuals must be absolved. That response has ritual elements, temples, offerings, mournful songs, and performative elements. The recitation of names, the placing of mounds, because the social fabric needs public acts to process private violence. The Heike frames these acts as essential. The story insists on them because without them, the losses would calcify into resentments that fuel further violence. The tale takes a practical view of ethics. Public ritual moderates private vendettas. Memory in the Heike is not inert archive. Memory is action. The survivors cares, reciting names, performing lamentations, commissioning images, do two things at once. They sanctify the loss, and they repurpose it into a didactic instrument. These acts turn the past into a lesson. The tale thereby manufactures cultural knowledge. Society learns what to fear, what to avoid, how to reorder authority, and how to ritualize remorse. Memory, kept by the survivors, stabilizes the learning process. It is not nostalgic, it is functional. The survivor who becomes a nun or a pilgrim carries more than sorrow. She carries the community's will to remember. That work of memory dissolves character into echo. The final movement of the Heike takes individual arcs and renders them into pattern. Voices repeat, images recur, the same lament appears in different mouths. What was once a living person becomes a motif. This is not erasure, rather it is conversion. A named man becomes a sentence in the moral grammar the story teaches. By the time the tale has run its course, the characters have been transmuted into categorical evidence. A model case of hubris, a model case of wasted talent, a model case of penitence, a model case of endurance. The tale's final vocation is to hold these models up so they can be read by future listeners as warnings and doctrines. The living world that birthed these people remains irretrievable, but the patterns born from it continue to instruct. Listen to how the narrative refuses closure, even when it seems to end a life. Deaths yield chants. Deaths yield memorial shrines. They yield new names to be sung at temples. That ritual continuation points forward. Still more names to be added. Still more songs to be learned. So the tale never lets its argument close like a neat verdict. Instead, it keeps the listener in motion. One story ends and another memory begins, each echoing the bell that opened the work. In that movement, the Heike accomplishes its central claim. Individuals do not merely act, they become readable as signs of a larger social process. Their glory, their ruin, and their repentance are not private fates but public proofs. The voices that remain after the blood dries are the ones who will shape what kind of polity follows, and their task is to name, to lament, to instruct. The effect is both sorrowful and precise. The tale does not indulge in elegy so much as it instructs by elegy. It refuses the consolations of novelty, no last-minute psychological twist that humanizes the tyrant beyond his function, and so the moral diagnosis remains clear. The overreacher remains an overreacher until his house collapses. The youth remains a youth until the sea consumes him. The penitent remains a penitent until his robe takes the place of his sword. The survivor remains a memory keeper whose job is to ensure these patterns persist as lessons. In that persistence, the Heike performs history as moral grammar, shaping how future ears will hear the past. You come away from the story not with the sense that these people were like you, but with the sense that their lives have been arranged to tell you how a world unravels and how a world repairs itself through ritual and governance. The characters dissolve into currents of meaning because the tale intends them to. That dissolution is not depersonalizing in the cruel sense. It is explanatory. It gives the listener a map of decline, and in that map, the names function as coordinates. By the end, the human figures have become the Heike's instruments. The bell, the flute, the robe, the temple, each ringing a lesson about the costs when power refuses limit. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.